Unwitnessed. There is a kind of pain that does not arise from a body at all, but from the absence of eyes. Not the eyes of surveillance or curiosity, but the eyes of recognition, the gaze that says, I see you, and therefore you are real. When that gaze disappears, the world does not merely go quiet, it begins to flicker. One's own existence starts to feel provisional, as though life had become a rehearsal with no audience and no guarantee of a performance. This is what may be called the condition of being unwitnessed. Human beings do not come into being only once at birth. They come into being continuously, through acknowledgement. Each word addressed to another, each glance, each act of care, is a confirmation that the interior life has an exterior horizon. To be unwitnessed is to lose that horizon. It is to live in an invisible room whose walls shift but whose door never opens. The experience is not only lonely, it is ontological. It undermines the very sense of being someone. The philosophers of recognition, Hegel, Levinas, Buber, all in different ways argued that the self is not an isolated kernel, but a movement toward the other. To be recognized is not to be flattered, it is to be constituted. Without recognition, the self still breathes, but its breath has no echo. A word spoken in a vacuum is only sound. A life lived without echo begins to doubt its own reality. This is why the condition of being unwitnessed produces not only sadness, but a strange, corrosive anger. Anger is the last assertion of the self's reality when the world seems to withhold acknowledgement. To be unwitnessed can occur in crowds as easily as in solitude. A person may be surrounded by faces and yet unseen. The crucial element is not the number of observers, but the presence of recognition. Surveillance is not witness. The camera records but does not care. The data profile catalogs but does not respond. The witness is someone who registers your existence as morally significant, someone who says by their attention, your being matters in the field of my own. The difference between being monitored and being witnessed is the difference between being measured and being met. The experience of being unwitnessed has a particular sharpness when it follows a long period of presumed visibility. As long as one feels part of a web of relations, colleagues, friends, family, neighbors, the self moves with a background hum of confirmation. When that hum stops, even if only briefly, the silence feels larger than the room. Is not merely disappointment in others, is the collapse of an invisible scaffolding that had held up the sense of self. And yet, this very collapse can reveal something otherwise hidden. In ordinary life, the self is constantly reflected back through others, and one forgets the difference between one's being and one's reputation. When the mirror goes dark, the self can, for a moment, be seen as it is, independent of applause or disapproval. That moment is terrifying, but it can also be clarifying. It shows how much of what we call me is really a network of echoes and how fragile those echoes are. But such clarity does not remove the need for witness. A person can endure moments of invisibility. No one can thrive in perpetual erasure. To be unwitnessed for too long is to begin to vanish from one's own life. The voice grows hesitant. Memory blurs. Even pain begins to feel abstract. The self requires at least one other consciousness to bounce against, one other presence to say, yes, this is happening, and yes, you are here. This is not a matter of ego. It is the architecture of existence. Communities, too, can become unwitnessed. Entire groups may live and work and suffer outside the field of recognition, their lives invisible except as statistics or slogans. The condition of being unwitnessed at scale produces not just individual despair, but collective alienation. It creates a world of parallel solitudes, each convinced of its own marginality, each unaware of the others. Recognition is not merely an interpersonal courtesy, it is a political necessity. The opposite of being unwitnessed is not fame, but relation. Fame is another kind of erasure. The self becomes a projection screen for fantasies. To be truly witnessed is to be seen in specificity, not in stereotype. It is to be met where one actually stands, with all one's contingencies and contradictions intact. Such witness may come quietly, a single word, a small act, but restores the world's contour. Philosophically, the condition of being unwitnessed shows the limits of individualism. The self cannot supply its own confirmation indefinitely. One may try to self-witness through diaries, recordings, artworks. These can help. They can even sustain life for long stretches. But at some point, their meaning depends on the imagined or actual presence of another. A diary hidden forever has a different aura than one written for possible eyes. Even when writing for oneself, one writes for a self who will later look back. The witness may be deferred, but it is still needed. There is also a temporal dimension to witness. Some acts are witnessed only after the fact. A book published decades after it was written, a letter read by a grandchild, an artwork discovered in an attic. This delayed recognition does not undo the pain of being unwitnessed in the moment, but it does show that witness can travel across time as well as space. To act, speak, or create even without immediate acknowledgement is to place a marker for a future witness, to trust that someone will someday say, "I see you," even then. The ethical implication is twofold. First, one ought to cultivate habits of witnessing others, especially the quiet, the marginal, the ones whose existence is not already amplified by status or power. Second, one ought to cultivate practices that keep one's own voice alive even when unwitnessed. Not to replace the need for others, but to keep the inner ground from eroding. To write, to sing, to pray, to speak into the air, these can be acts of witness planted like seeds, awaiting their season. In this sense, the experience of being unwitnessed is both wound and invitation. It hurts because it cuts into the root of our being, but it also invites a deeper understanding of what it means to be human, a creature whose life is a dialogue, whose selfhood is a joint construction, whose dignity is upheld in part by the gaze of another. To know this is to be better able to offer witness in return, to become for someone else the presence that confirms their existence. Unwitnessed life is not a lesser life. Is life deprived of one of its natural nutrients? Like a plant kept in shade, it survives but does not fully flower. Recognition is sunlight. To offer it, even in a glance, is to participate in creation. To withhold it is to dim the world a little. The philosopher's task is to keep this truth visible even when society prefers to forget it. Thus, the concept of unwitnessed is not merely a psychological description, but an ethical challenge. It asks, where have you withdrawn your gaze? Whose existence are you ignoring into shadow? And also, what will you do to keep your own voice from going silent when no one is watching? In answering these questions, one does not abolish the condition, but one begins to transform it. Even a small act of seeing can interrupt the drift toward erasure. In the end, to be unwitnessed is to stand on the edge of invisibility. To offer witness is to pull someone, however slightly, back into the shared world. This exchange of seeing and being seen is not a luxury, but a foundation. Without it, cells wither. With it, even the most fragile life gains weight and shape. The task is not to make everyone visible at once, but to hold open the possibility of recognition, to keep alive the simple, radical act of saying, "I see you. You are real."